It's me, Erin, and I'm here with...
I'm Vanessa Gavin. I am a secondary EAL Consultant, new to the role this year.
And we're going to talk today about this Reading Screeners project, or just teaching reading through the lens of EAL. This first question is kind of obvious. It's kind of like, when you look at reading through an EAL lens, what are the things that you would want to highlight?
So when it comes to EAL instruction, reading is very important. In junior high, we assess reading as part of our benchmark assessments every year to inform our teaching practices. Every day, our students are asked to read across all curricular subject areas. Reading tasks range from daily instruction tasks to assignments to quizzes and tests. And it's important that we help our students improve in their reading so that they can feel confident in completing these tasks.
Yeah, I think that confidence is a huge aspect of it, right? And with EAL, you're dealing not just with the reading academic text, you're also just dealing with communication, very basic, essential communication that we expect from students without an EAL kind of background, right? So there's kind of two things going on. Well, actually, probably more like 5, 6, 7, 8 things going on when it comes to those specific students. So what are some different reading strategies that you would recommend in a classroom where EAL is kind of like a presence?
So some key strategies that are beneficial to our ELL students that also work in junior high include introducing key language prior to reading, accessing multilingual books if they're available, as well as multicultural literature and culturally responsive text where they can relate to the characters of the story.
That's huge in English as well, right? Just from a diversity lens, not even just to have students relate to something that they're familiar with, but actually especially to have students interact with things they're unfamiliar with.
For sure. Yeah. Modeling reading and strategies for our students, allowing access to first language translation to reference and empower students to use these tools when they can. Using text with lots of graphics as much as possible is really helpful in some of the core subject classes. Giving students access to audio versions of text so that students can listen to reading, and using graphic organizers that can focus on vocabulary learning while reading a text.
I think too, when it comes to graphic organizers, that one ties to the one you said earlier about modeling, right? It's not just giving people access to squares and stuff on pages, it's showing them exactly
how to use it,
right? And even the order in which to use it,
right?
Something that's come up with the other core consultants specifically would be the use of graphs, and we give students that to kind of augment their understanding, but we don't always take the time to explain how to read a graph.
That's right.
And what happens when students don't do that, and this is what the math consultant let me know, is that students make erroneous assumptions that cost them when it comes to a standardized assessment.
Absolutely.
Yeah, a lot of the things that you're describing, I know you're still talking about them, but they do strike me as they falling under that UDL framework, right? What's best for the EAL kid is best for all the kids, which is just another reason to do it over and over and over again.
Right.
Yeah.
And lastly, reviewing what was read and checking for understanding. It's one thing to know that the student has read something, but are they understanding what they're reading? Yeah, and
I guess checking that understanding, kind of in a formative sense, right? It could be just verbally. It could be thumbs up, thumbs down, right? It doesn't have to be always a formal written thing, a product that gets handed in.
Right.
Yeah, because that's just more work for the teacher, and that's not what we're trying to do. So how can a teacher, I guess all teachers are language teachers, right, in this EAL kind of lens, how can a teacher set up their classroom routines that would do two things at once, right? Because we want to help beginning students improve their reading. We also want to challenge those average or proficient students to increase their reading in a junior high context. Junior high students should always be getting better at something. Right?
So firstly, like you mentioned, it's important to realize that we are all teachers of language. Regardless of the subject you teach, there's always language that needs to be learned in all of them. And having said that, it's important that reading strategies are taught within all of our lessons and practiced regularly. This could look like reading passages or maybe articles in social studies or science to our students, giving them time to read during our lessons while also following up to check for that understanding. For our ELL students, you can sit them next to another student in the classroom who can also speak their first language so that they can engage in dialogue about what they're reading. giving them time to practice and check for their understanding is going to be key in their reading development and to guide your practice and what happens next.
Yeah. I would say, well, I mean, I believe this for every student, actually. I would say delaying the grade as much as humanly possible is part of creating that space for a student to make mistakes safely, right? And when it comes to like language acquisition, there's going to be so many mistakes like for such a long time. So it's tough to balance that, right? Like checking for content and also leaving room for language. But I think that, again, it helps everyone in the end.
Absolutely, it does.
All right. So another question I have to you, and I mean, I think we've been talking about this all along too, but like, what are those obstacles that exist in trying to implement those things, for example? I would say, first of all, my enemy, the schedule. Every single video has just been like, this is the time. There's no time for any of it. So I'm sure that comes up, but what are some other ones?
So from an EAL perspective, the most common obstacle will be having students at varying levels of reading proficiency in the same classroom. So in a single classroom, we might see everything from levels 1 to 5, and the challenge becomes ensuring that we're providing them all with opportunities to enhance their reading skills, as you mentioned. We have to remember that ELLs are learning English plus content at the same time, and that becomes a struggle as well. We also might have students with limited formal schooling, so it's important to recognize with these students, they might not have learned how to read in their first language. So in the case of a level 1 student who does know how to read in their first language, they have already learned strategies that will, for the most part, carry over into reading English. A student with limited formal schooling needs to be taught these strategies from the beginning.
Yeah, one of the things that we talked about in like this previous presentation for today is like the science of reading, or the neuroscience of it, right? That the pathways in the brain that exist for reading in a student that hasn't had formal schooling or been taught to read in their first language, those pathways don't yet exist, or they're not as strongly connected. Right. So, I mean, that is quite a task just for a student's brain, right? To like understand like the phonics and the phonemic awareness in their own language, now a second language, and to kind of connect those things to graphemes. That's a lot going on, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So this is where explicit teaching of predicting, summarizing, making inference skills becomes so important, in addition to building background knowledge using visuals and pre-teaching of vocab.
Yeah. It also occurs to me, and this is maybe going back to the routine schedule, but like in a class where you have that's EAL presence, right? Like, I don't know what number you consider to be a presence, but like the opportunities have to be consistent and like going forever, which to me is kind of the antithesis of like a lecture style class. Right? Like if it's just not going to work, you have to have the kids talking as much as possible in English to be able to kind of gain that. And like, yeah, so instead of you asking them questions, they're the ones asking each other questions, right? Like just give your lesson plan to your students and have them kind of quiz one another, because the language has to be coming out of their mouths.
Absolutely. And we want them to progress in language proficiency in all 4 of their strands.
Wow. Morphology, which is like the new word of this project. What are some ways that a teacher can begin to incorporate those kinds of strategies, like morphology being one of them, into their lessons, do you think?
So in terms of strategies, I'd like to focus a little bit on vocabulary and building the capacity in terms of vocab. Research shows that someone needs to be able to understand 95% of the words in a text that they're reading in order to fully comprehend that with ease. I know when I read that was kind of shocking to me. 95% seems like quite a lot. So that's why it's important that we develop these strategies to teach the vocabulary. If they understand the words, that will encourage them to understand the reading passage a little better. So making sure that our students have access to lots of visuals. I am a huge fan of word walls, even in the junior high class.
That's such a tough sell, I think, you know? I mean, there's like a lot of kind of things about that are potentially frustrating for teachers. So some teachers are sharing classrooms. They have to move around, right? So it's tough to kind of pin down to a wall. And I think too, like, I don't know, and I'm not against word walls by any means. Like, I teach language. I mean, I love words. But I think that, well, here's what the social teacher said, right? Is that how how to teach a word wall and how to incorporate it consistently into the classroom. Do you know what I mean? Because like words on a wall like mean nothing out of context. And so he was saying putting the word Western word views on the wall isn't going to help them, because like the word Western just means like of the West, right? What would be like a junior high version of a word wall?
So you could have the students have a personal word wall where they have little personal dictionaries that they can take with them to their different classes. One thing that I used to do in my science classroom is at the start of the unit, every student got assigned a word and they had to draw out what that word meant. So it was the word on the wall, not a summarized definition of what the word is, but a picture representing what that word meant. So in your term of Western, actually show like a picture of when we're talking about Western
stuff,
like where are we talking about, and actually have that on the map under that word. But again, in junior high, if teachers are changing classrooms, they could have the students bring like a personal dictionary and do more of that sort of thing.
Yeah, like something I would do in English would be like a running glossary of terms, right?
Yeah.
And that was more text-based, although it didn't have to be. We want to be flexible to complement the teacher's style.
Sure. So anchor charts as well as graphic organizers. Anchor charts are kind of nice because you can remove them from the wall and sort of take them with you where you're teaching, right? It's not something as permanent as a word wall, but that graphic organizer piece is huge as well. And again, like we mentioned earlier, teaching students how to use them, not just giving them a blank template and letting them try to figure out how it's used. So all of these things can provide them with tools that they need to understand vocabulary in what they're reading.
So I mean, if we're going to start incorporating those new things, there would be things that we have to let go of, right? Because we're not just piling on more stuff. We already know time is a huge commodity. So what are some things that you might recommend kind of like letting go of or moving away from in favor of these strategies that would help to support a student's reading?
Sure. So some practices that I would recommend avoiding would be putting a student in isolation to work on a task while the rest of the class is doing another activity that we might think is too hard for that student. Even if a student is a beginning English language learner, having them simply listen to text can help them develop reading strategies. Being with age-appropriate peers and being immersed in an English-rich environment is so beneficial to language acquisition. The other practice I wanted to highlight is having students read silently. Something to consider might be listening to our ELL students read and checking for their understanding as they read to paint that full picture of their reading ability instead of having them read something silently and not doing that check-in piece at the end, because without that check-in piece at the end, we don't know that they actually understood what they're reading.
Well, and I think the thing about silent reading, and I'm again thinking from like an LA teacher context, right? We want students to be able to enjoy reading and have space in our rooms for them to engage with that.
Right.
But again, if we have students who have the baseline like inability, they're not comprehending 90% of what they are reading, it's not enjoyable. It's confounding. And I would say like in that case then, you know, depending on the size of your room, how many students that you have, I would say, you know, take a student who you know is struggling with reading fluency and pair them up with a student who isn't reading at that level in EAL, and have the student practice fluency while the other student is practicing listening. You're then, again, raising up not the same skills, but complementary skills that all support reading.
Absolutely. And the other thing with our junior high students is they're really good at making it seem like they understand or making it seem like they're doing the reading when they're not, because they can't. So again, making sure that we have pieces in there where we're checking in or having them converse with each other to keep them sort of accountable, and then we know where they're at.
You know, it's funny because I was thinking like time is the enemy of teaching. But I'm also thinking in so many ways marking and grading is also the enemy, right? Because, and those things are related, because sometimes, right, we have to get a number into the grade book by this time, so we're just going to do whatever. And so then I give a graphic organizer and I'm just going to give you a quick mark on it and check your organization. But for when those skills are like so emergent, it's really not helping anyone. Right? You're just kind of telling a student what they already know, which is like, you're not good at this yet because you're still learning it. Well, that's a foregone conclusion.
Exactly. And they're not going to do well if you just give them a graphic organizer and tell them to fill it out, right? They don't know how. Oh man, it's tough. It's tough to do it. So, but we're here, I guess, to support
support you and kind of work on this together. So we'll continue to kind of work together and build more resources and kind of go deeper into this. But I just want to thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and that's it.
Bye.